Yes, it's
We
fine.
hear
Okay.
you and
All
see
right.
you.
Thank you.
You're good.
All right. Perfect. So the question here is, what is cybersecurity and data security? This is an important question for every business to answer. Every part of the business is impacted by the result, not just the IT guy in the corner office, but also marketing, sales, customer relationships, and the business bottom line. All are affected by the answer. In today's world of growing IT complexity, internet technology, mobile device integrations, connected technologies throughout the business, and a growing dependency on data, it's very important to not only understand the risks of cyber attacks and disasters, but to manage those risks effectively. These risks present themselves in our environment in various forms, some intentional and some unintentional, in the form of changing technology, people, and the processes that can do great harm to data, our customers, and our reputations. The goal of managing risks is to protect customers, protect the business, and to keep your data safe. This goal is accomplished by implementing cybersecurity and data security measures into the business. Cybersecurity is defined as the state or practice of being protected against criminal and unauthorized use of electronic data, or the measures taken to achieve this. Whereas data security is defined as protecting digital data, such as those in a database, from destructive forces and unwanted actions of any unauthorized user, such as a cyber attacker, or any failure or unapproved usage, or actual data loss in the event of a data breach. National and international security compliance organizations are introducing more and more requirements into the marketplace and various industries to better protect customers and consumers from abuses and exploits to their data. Two prominent compliance regulations are GDPR and CCPA. CCPA being the United States compliance originating in California, and GDPR being a European compliance, both governing cybersecurity and consumer data security requirements. They are similar in some ways, but expounding and expanding in different ways, making the rules more complex. Today, we're hoping to start you on your journey to understanding just how to keep your data safe. That said, I'm so excited to have Julie Fitton, VP of Digital Product Security, explain the importance of compliance and security in your business. So Julie, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Noah. I'm going to take you through some of the foundational principles around maintaining privacy and then tackle that really challenging question of what constitutes reasonable security. Noah, if you could jump to the next slide, please. The various privacy local regulations that are out there, CCPA and GDPR being the primary, but also noting that there are many local, regional, and deep fed privacy regulations that are out there. I thought it would be helpful to sort of deconstruct some of the alphabet soup around this variety that we see and talk you through some of those base privacy principles that we see threaded throughout all of the local laws. This presentation and this information is not meant to replace receiving guidance from your local legal counsels that are specific to your region and the types of information in the geographies where you do business, but it should provide you with a really great foundation of what the core requirements are and what you're going to see pop up in many of the different regulations. First is providing notice. It's important to tell individuals what personal information is collected, why it's collected, and with whom it will be shared. You see the notice requirement showing up across many of those regional localized privacy regulations and legislation, and it is a critical part of staying in compliance with privacy laws. Next is giving the individual a choice. Individuals should have the right to choose how and when and for what purpose their personal information is collected and used. And choice goes beyond just gaining an approval from the customer to use it as you intend. Your services should allow for the consumers to opt out and still gain access to your service if they choose not to feel comfortable with your intended usage of their personal information. Access and correction. Individuals provide access to personal need to be able to be provided access to their personal information about them that you have collected, and be given the opportunity to correct that incorrect or incomplete data that you may have. So in practice, what this means is you need mechanisms in place to be able to gather up all of the sources of personal information that you may be storing on a person when requested to do so, and provide it to them so that they have a clear visibility, understanding, and awareness of the information that you have, and provide them with a mechanism to give you feedback if something that you have contained in your systems is incorrect or inaccurate so that it can be properly corrected. It doesn't have to necessarily be an elegant mechanism for these things, but it is important that you have some type of out of band, even if it's an ad hoc mechanism, to be able to account for that if asked. Auditing and monitoring. Having a process in place to check whether privacy compliance programs are being followed in your business operations. The implementation of many of these requirements around handling of privacy information ends up becoming a distributed responsibility in your organization. People going about their everyday work and duties end up encountering and collecting and working with personal information, and there needs to be an overarching governance model deployed within your entity to ensure that all of those distributed folks know and understand the requirements and have the tools that they need to be able to implement the proper measures around your privacy obligations. Data retention and correction. Retaining personal information for no longer than the period of time that serves the purpose for which information was collected, unless you're issued with some type of legal hold or under law it's provided for otherwise that you have a requirement to retain that data. Next slide, please, Noah. Next is agreements with third-party service providers. For many of you, CribMaster would fall into this category. Whenever personal information is shared or disclosed to a third-party service, there should be a written agreement with the third party, whether affiliated or unaffiliated to you, relating to the handling of personal information. It's important that your supply chain understands the requirements that you're upholding to and is ready and prepared to implement similar measures in their practices to support your obligations to maintain privacy and be able to meet your commitments to the regulations and the laws. Also to consider is cross-border transfer limitations. Certain countries' laws contain additional rules and limitations when a local entity wishes to share information with a third party outside of the country. There are accommodations for this type of business arrangement, but it is important to note that there are requirements to put special agreements in place under certain circumstances and within certain countries to facilitate this sharing of information across geographical boundaries. Registration. In certain countries, the local entity is obligated to register its handling and transferring of personal information to third parties with a local data protection authority and/or appoint a data protection officer. Again, this is a country by country requirement and needs to be evaluated for your particular circumstances, but it's important to note that that requirement for registration does appear in many regional privacy laws. And finally, you have an obligation to secure all of that personal information that you've collected. Everything we've talked about up until now is guidance and guidelines around your handling of personal information in the course of legitimately providing business and services. The security requirement provides an obligation that you are taking measures to prevent a breach or unauthorized disclosure of personal information to someone who attempts to break in through vulnerabilities and flaws. Next slide, please. And Noah will be going through in a lot more detail some areas that can be considered reasonable security measures. But I'd like to start off at this point of the presentation talking about how do you determine reasonable security? It's a very nebulous reference that's made in the privacy regulations and laws. And I like to correlate this to something that might be a little bit more familiar to you, a topic of personal safety. If I consider my own personal physical safety and threat of attack or harm coming to me as a person, reasonable security would likely mean that I, park in well-lit areas. I don't walk around in dark alleys at night where I could be vulnerable to a physical attack. But for the most part, I don't take any extraordinary measures to protect my personal safety. We live in a fairly safe and lawful society in the United States, and we have a certain degree of comfort that our personal safety is protected through having law enforcement and society. But if you take that same principle and you apply it to a public figure like the President of the United States, reasonable security for a public figure may far exceed the requirements that would be considered reasonable for Julie Fitton as a private citizen. Things like personal bodyguards, armored vehicles to drive down the streets, sending in a reconnaissance team prior to visiting a public venue where there could be threats to ensure that the environment is hardened and that no one is hiding out in a linen closet that's going to jump out and pose a threat. For someone who's a private citizen, that would be considered extraordinary security. For someone who's a public figure and who may be a targeted person, these measures would be considered reasonable to protect that person. So hopefully this analogy helps draw some correlations for you that the term reasonable really is circumstantial. And a partnership between the Chief Information Security Officer and the Chief Privacy Officer is critical to understanding those circumstances within your environment and designing and implementing reasonable security measures that provide the right protection without overburdening certain types of privacy information that may be safely protected with far lower bar for what is considered reasonable versus something that may require a more extraordinary set of circumstances like social security numbers or annual income or credit score. So hopefully that helps put some context around this nebulous concept of reasonable security. And at this point, I will hand it over to Esteban, who will talk in some more detail about GDPR specifics and some things to consider and implement when diving into the hard requirements around GDPR. Esteban?
Thank you, Julie. So hello, everyone. Just before moving on, I just would like to mention that no matter the location of our system, the priority of our team is to keep your data safe and align with the local compliance of data protection. So let's move on to the next slide question, please. What is the approach to comply with GDPR specifically? So in the next section, I will provide a high-level overview to understand the major documents and processes that are currently available. Let's start on the next slide. The main consideration of the GDPR is actually to establish a proper agreement. Such agreement is called DPA, for Data Processing Agreement. So inside the DPA, we will define two major stakeholders, the data controllers and the data processors. Basically, in the CribMaster business, the data controllers would be the distributors and users of CribMaster who own and gather the information, versus the data processor, who is actually the CribMaster entity that will process and manage the information. If we go deeper in what goes inside the DPA, first, the main consideration is that CribMaster entity will not deal with information without prior approval. Interaction with data sworn to confidentiality, of course. Second, all appropriate technical and organizational measures will be consolidated inside a specific document called TOM. So I will provide further details about that concept in a few minutes. Third, the processor will not subcontract unless instructed by controller. For example, external database administrator will require access for database maintenance. Will request, of course, a prior validation from our controllers. Fourth, CribMaster will help controller maintaining GDPR compliance. As a partner, CribMaster will, of course, work closely with our customer to be fully aligned and compliant with GDPR. Fifth, in case an hosted service environment is terminated, we will proceed accordingly with data stored. We will delete or return the data when necessary. And finally, as any other IT companies, CribMaster can be subject to audit and share with our customer details about the compliance. So let's move on to the next slide and get an overview of the TOM document. The TOM abbreviation stands for Technical and Organizational Measures. This document contains different subjects. Each section will provide further high-level details on our specification. You can, of course, always contact us for more advanced technical details. The first one is related to document and risk management. CribMaster will, of course, maintain, centralize, validate, and store all documentation, such as contract, DPAs, and agreement. And CribMaster will identify any risk according to cybersecurity and vulnerabilities to make sure we trigger the appropriate action plan. Regarding security consideration and policies, CribMaster will maintain strict cybersecurity policies in alignment with the Stanley Black & Decker IT group and working closely with the Digital Product Security group. It will be important that all employees of CribMaster follow the required security and privacy training on an annual basis. About access and vulnerability management. Only employee will be granted to access the different environments, so specific employees only. Any vulnerabilities of threat will be regularly identified and analyzed to provide efficient resolution plans and corrective actions. In terms of control and validation of our software, and in relation with the concept of privacy by design, CribMaster will introduce the principle of privacy at early stage of development. Any changes and updates inside the software will be controlled and validated through intensive QA processes to meet the compliance. And latest point, the physical security of our data center will be allowed only to specific persons for specific activities. The access to facility will be, of course, reinforced by an external security team. These are the major subjects covered inside our TOM document, and this reference is available on our resource site. Don't hesitate to reach our account manager if you need further details. And now I'm glad to introduce the next session led by Noah, who will provide us further details regarding the data security.
Thanks, Esteban. So with all that we've shared so far, it's fair to ask, how can I keep my data safe? So I want to connect what we've learned about compliance requirement to actual steps that can be taken in your environment to be more cyber secure. There's a lot to consider on the topic of keeping your data safe. Obviously more than we can cover in a 1-hour session, so I'll attempt to quickly touch on some very important data security pillars that are necessary to understand the scope of data security in your environment. First, data security requires the actual data or the data infrastructure be secured. That's your secured data platform. Also, there is security monitoring or security analytics and the analytic tools that you use to accomplish that need to be deployed to manage your security. And you need secure operations, also called standard operating procedures, to govern security in the environment. These pillars are foundational. So here's what I mean. To accomplish the goals of cybersecurity, security teams need the right knowledge, the right tools, and the right processes to perform better, to perform faster, and to be accurate in their investigations. Teams need to stay ahead of threats and security concerns that approach the environment. Teams must quickly find out the root cause of an incident or a vulnerability if there's a breach. And there needs to be some incident reporting around what happened, why and how, in order to learn from it and in order to react to it properly. There needs to be some forensics that that security team is able to deploy to reconstruct detailed timelines and understanding what was going on throughout the entire scenario. And it requires that the security team know the why of the attack, the kind of data that was exposed. And that goes back to Julie's point about reasonable levels of security and knowing which data needed to be secured and protected based on its classification and what data was not as necessary or was not as exposed. And then these security teams also need 360-degree visibility into all activity in the environment with very effective monitoring. New challenges are pushing modern security requirements to their limits. At the top of the pyramid, there's the actual data security. But to accomplish that, all the underlying infrastructure in the data platform must also be secured. Measures must be taken to secure all of your infrastructure. That includes applications, host systems, internal networks, perimeter devices like firewalls, physical environments, and implementing security policies and procedures that guide awareness throughout the business. That also includes protecting all the new and emerging technologies in your environments so that those aren't exposed. Attackers are very motivated to exploit any available attack surface or opening to gain access to private information by exploiting passwords that can then be routed back to their systems and give them access to your company's servers and data. This can result in very bad financial loss, loss of reputation, and incur deep non-compliance penalty. So at this point, you might be asking, how can I recognize and prevent an attack on our systems and our data? Let's start with your internet exposure, or basically all the ways you can connect your business to the internet that can cause there to be a vulnerability and to understand where those vulnerabilities are, including accessing websites and using web-based applications. It's important to secure and scan your network connections to the internet. The internet and the web are significant pathways for intrusion into your environment. Some commonly exploited attack surfaces to consider are web-based attacks using scripting techniques, SQL injections, stolen credentials. Then there's DDoS attacks, which are attacks against your firewall that I mentioned earlier. And there are attacks on the network using stolen passwords. The good news is there's a defense against these scenarios. Just like good personal hygiene, there are best practices and security hygiene steps to be taken to mitigate and protect yourself from security risks. Most commonly, we may have heard of keeping your software patched and updated and current. But in addition to that step, we need to perform regular security scans or penetration testings. To minimize the attack surfaces in the environment means limiting access to your important data to only those that actually need that access. And for that perimeter defense, there are technologies like VPN that make sure that your remote workers are validated appropriately to gain the access that they're supposed to have. Minimize access to APIs. APIs are basically how applications in your environment are permitted to talk to other applications. That also needs to be secured. And then there's using technologies like single sign-on that authenticate your users. Invest in managed security or managed environments like hosted services. We deploy, all of these technologies, and procedures and practices in defense of our customers, and in making sure that their data is in best-in-class protection. Also, invest in training programs to keep staff informed, learning how they might identify phishing campaigns that would be used to social engineer and get those passwords that would make the environment vulnerable. Educate customers on best practices, and enforce rules like complex passwords and multi-factor authentication, which requires more than one validation process in order to authenticate them to get access into the environment. And it's always a wise decision for a business to invest in cyber insurance, which is another level of security as your environment is insured. How do I identify a threat? As I said before, your defense really starts with strong policies and procedures. Good policies and procedures that guide best practice are very important to every business. That includes policies that govern system monitoring, network security, endpoint security, and identity and access management. And that governs how people access the environment. So these policies and procedures that you deploy into your environment need to also be guided by trusted and leading compliances. Compliances like ISO 9001:2015 for operational best practices. Then there's ISO 27001 for cloud integrity. And the cloud would cover any infrastructure that you have, like Azure and AWS and other providers. SOC 2 Type 2 for data center security. And then, of course, there's GDPR and CCPA, national and international compliances that, like what we're discussing here today. And then there are other leading industry compliances to consider. We've talked a lot about procedures. So at this point, I'd be asking, which data security procedure do I follow? Where do I start? As Julie and Esteban expressed earlier in the webinar, both GDPR, and CCPA lay out the requirements. The key data security procedures to create for your business are as follows. Identity and access management, which is governing, again, how those users access the data in your environment. Logging and monitoring, which gives your security team visibility into what's happening in the environment. Data classification, which is the procedure and process to establish what that reasonable level of security is for that data. Incident management, which governs how you deal with a breach or a disaster in the event that either happens. Penetration testing, that is the process whereby you validate your security, making sure that you are secure and learning, where those vulnerabilities are when they exist. Vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is the process by which we appropriately deal with the vulnerabilities as we discover them. And exception management is the process by which we mitigate and move those processes that didn't necessarily fall at the higher level of risk as the higher priority, those higher level of security items for the vulnerability management process, but we still want to manage them appropriately as exceptions. Attack profile valuation, that is a methodology by which you discover where those attack surfaces are, where those openings are that you need to close and to better secure the environment. And then there's cloud hardening for environments that do have some cloud infrastructure, as in using AWS or Azure to host any of your systems or applications. And there's data handling, which includes the organization's encryption and secure communications. These data security procedures are only a sample of the many steps taken by CribMaster and hosted services to secure our customers' data. That said, I want to explain a little bit more about each of these steps. Step 1, identity and access management. This procedure says who can access the data and your network, the servers, the applications, the cloud and data center, and any data, and under what conditions. Basically, who is it and what is their need? Step 2, logging and monitoring. Invest in applications, tools, and services that scan your environment from the inside. This is how you can detect weaknesses in your security. Early on, it's your early warning system. Step 3, data classification. A procedure to classify whether data is sensitive or non-sensitive by category, and this is based on business requirement. This has serious implications for GDPR and CCPA and assists with risk mitigations when they happen. As I mentioned previously, security teams need to know how to handle the highest risk data, and if that data is sensitive, what's the appropriate next step. Step 4, incident management. This is critical. An incident management procedure needs to guide process in the event of a breach or disaster. An incident being defined as any occurrence that jeopardizes the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an information system. So think about how your organization will identify an incident, contain it, fix it, recover back to normal after an incident, learn from it, and prepare improved defenses. Step 5, penetration testing. You need a penetration testing procedure to inject ad hoc, adversarial, and continuous security testing measures into your protection plan. This process will test for perimeter and exterior weaknesses in your internet defenses. Pen testing should cover all of your attack surfaces that your application has in that data pyramid we discussed earlier. Step 6, vulnerability and exception management. Vulnerability and exception management processes complement one another. The vulnerability management process details how to protect against, remediate, and fix vulnerabilities that can cause great harm and expose your data to attackers, whereas the exception management process explains how to manage the cases that deviate from your normal remediation plans. Step 7, attack profile valuation. Attack profile valuation is the method, as I said earlier, to determine where your organization has its most significant risks. Sometimes the greatest risks are external attackers. However, sometimes the strongest attack vectors are from inside the network due to lack of training, staff negligence, or other problem areas in the business. Step 8, cloud hardening. If you have infrastructure in the cloud like AWS or Azure, then cloud hardening is very important. Cloud hardening uses tools, techniques, and best practices to reduce the risk to your data and technology in the cloud. For instance, hosted services has hardened all of its environments with very significant protection layers as part of our infrastructure to make sure that we valued our data and our customers and protected that data. Lastly, but certainly not least, step 9, data handling. There are data handling procedures that the business must have. These are the policies to govern how data is encrypted, accessed, and handled by both customers and staff. Encryption is an important first defense in case data is ever transmitted, stored, or accessed in a way that exposes it. Once you've taken those important first steps, you need to keep the momentum. You need tools and standard operating procedures that help you maintain a high level of security. Security processes need to be supported by monitoring and analytic tools to help your defense strategy. And there needs to be those operating procedures to keep everyone on the same page. So the question is, which tools can I use to ensure my data is safe? The answer, there is no one answer. You can choose from security incident and event management tools, and even add automated security steps to some of the tooling that's available to you to help keep your defenses up 24/7. Ultimately, though, you want to investigate what threat analysis and protection tools are on the market. Reach out to security professionals like those here at CribMaster when we're hosting your data, and choose the right fit for your business. Security must be built into your business processes. Your operating procedures and the corporate culture must reflect the importance of security. That's reflected in how you educate staff, require security, and follow the steps we've outlined. There are ways to integrate security and business processes very tightly. Most significant are methods called Agile and DevSecOps. Both terms are borrowed from software development and have been applied to ways of doing business and maintaining security. Agile is essentially bringing all the separate processes together and creating a collaborative and integrated system. Your security is aligned with what the business already does. Whereas DevSecOps is a methodology recommended by security experts for any environment that uses code to implement infrastructure, like in Azure or AWS cloud environments. That process is called infrastructure as a code for deploying your infrastructure. So to do that securely, DevSecOps acts as a philosophy for integrating security in development and the development practices around those deployments. This includes collaboration between environment security and the operations teams doing the work. As a final reminder, embed security in your business. Make sure that security is built into everything. Security problems are fixed as early as possible, and that the security mindset is part of your organizational training and culture. So happy to pass the mic to Judy Worrells, our hosted services IIS admin and subject matter expert, to share a live security demo on the CribMaster client application. Thanks, Judy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. We have some best practices that we like to apply within our CribMaster application. The security of our application is critical for the customer data. Application security is part of the compliance's standard to control and protect access to the customer data. On the screen, we see security access codes. They are used to grant or deny employee access to certain CribMaster functions. Security access codes offer a way of grouping job functions together and then assigning that group of functions to an employee or group of employees. These codes are used in combination with the Crib Privileges section on the Access tab of the Employee Properties. You can see here we have different example of groups of types of functions that employees might perform. Within this, you can see the different permissions that have been granted. You can grant and remove permissions easily by using this particular feature to change the permission set. Then we would go to the employee property screen. In the employee property screen, one of the new features that we have in the later versions of our 10.15 and 11 versions is a access level, which is application layer control. Basically, it says global means I have all applications and all sites and all features. So I don't have any site access tab availability because it's global. It grants everybody everything for that particular person. General is all applications, but it has a site access tab, which allows you to add and remove cribs or areas, to have groups of features that maybe a stalker might have to go out on a bread run. Anyway, limited is ATR and Advantage Web, no client access or CM Web, and the restricted is ATR only. So within the features, you'll see an access tab, and we can see by selecting on the different group what permissions they have. If you see a little check mark of a guy, that means I've overridden that particular permission for that specific employee only. Then we can go to the site access tab. This feature I think is very awesome because it allows me to actually remove permissions from one specific crib or a group of cribs, or I can have a primary and a secondary route for my bread man, for my suppliers, or for even technicians that migrate from site to site. So that is basically an overview of how CribMaster allows you to control your access to your different data for each customer availability and functionality. Thank you, and back to Georgia.
Thank you, Judy. So we're actually going to transition into the Q&A session, or portion of this session, excuse me. So if you haven't asked a question yet and you have one, feel free to ask that now. So I'll go ahead and answer or ask those to the panel now. And like I said, if you have any additional questions.
Yeah.
So our first question, I'll go ahead and direct this to Noah. What is the cost of hosting?
Well, each connection is licensed, so there are connection licenses, and so that being said, we recommend that you reach out to a sales rep for more information, since costs differ based on business specific needs and the type of connection you're inquiring about.
Just got another question. So someone asked, is there a way to lock ability to log in as CribMaster versus admin?
Judy, I think you're on mute.
Noah.
Actually, Judy, you're on mute there.
Looks like I'm muted now.
There you are.
Okay,
Yes,
there is a way into the client. It is in the config file. You can add a line that locks the role. It is per workstation. So for each client installation in the config file, you can add a line that will lock that role.
Awesome. Thank you, Judy. Next question. If I do have CribMaster host my database, can CribMaster diagnose problems remotely? This is probably a question for Noah or Judy.
Oh, I can take that one. So yes, yeah. So if we're hosting your database, we actually have the data. We have the database and we have that back-end infrastructure. And as I suggested earlier, you know, we have lots of levels of security and monitoring, so we can quickly address issues, you know, as they're happening. But if part of that troubleshooting involves the endpoints, the ATRs, for instance, any part of the infrastructure that's in your organization's environment, then we would reach out to you. We wouldn't, you know, be able to just kind of take over and remotely access our customer's environment, but we'd coordinate that effort. And the same is true if we aren't hosting. If you call our technical support team and you needed some remote assistance, that can be arranged, and we just work with the customer to gain that appropriate level of access.
Awesome. Next, why is it important to comply with both GDPR and CCPA requirements? I think probably anyone on the panel could answer this, but I'm going to go ahead and leave this up to Noah and probably Esteban to take this one.
Actually, I'd like to split this one up a little bit, but I'll start with the answer. So these compliances, as I said earlier, are extremely important. They're international and national compliances that protect both the customer, the consumers, essentially those who our organizations are here to serve. And with that said, how we handle that responsibility is what those compliances are attempting to govern and to assist us with governing internally. So they're guidance regulations, but they're also enforceable regulations. So violating those regulations is harmful to your customer. That's the first reason not to do it. But secondly, they are compliance regulations that are enforced. So there are other impacts to the business. So that being said, we really have to be aware of and be able to respond to CCPA and GDPR appropriately. And I do want to open that up to anyone else on the panelists that may want to add.
Yeah, I think it's important that nowadays, I would say that subject is coming more and more. So considering that 3-4 years ago, I would say all our distributors were, I would say, going easily to the different location of their end user. And now it's a discussion that I would say it's coming more often. And definitely, I would say having CribMaster strong, I would say with a strong architecture, with strong processes about the security, and making sure we can manage and handle your security of your data, it's really key. And these compliance are very important for your end users. So I think it's not really a choice. It will be mandatory and more, I would say, reinforced in the future. And having that capabilities to show all these compliance and all these processes, regulation that we are putting in place for you, for our customers, will help definitively to enter new markets and to enter new end users, definitely.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, Esteban and Noah. Another question just came through. I think this is probably one for Noah or Judy, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. If customers have restrictions through their firewall, how can the cribs be accessed by us?
That's a difficult question.
Yeah. So if the customer has restrictions through their firewall, how can we access their cribs? Did I get that scenario correctly? Okay. So the answer is, yeah. So the answer is we can't, depending on how those restrictions are structured. There are ways to access the cribs remotely, but you'd have to at least arrange it so that you have those regular internet ports open. You may have heard it, port 80, port 443, HTTP, HTTPS. The secure way, of course, is HTTPS. And we can then use a tool with your permission to access that endpoint through port 443, or just over the internet. There are other ways to access an environment, but whatever level we decide on, we collaborate with the customer to come upon the best way to do that.
Yeah, it's something that by experience, I would say in the last years, a lot of exchange actually with the IT department just to make sure we can have access. Sometimes in some location, it's just not possible to enter. So we need to find other ways to define other networks like 4G networks, these kind of, I would say, safe networks, or external networks that give us the ability to remote in. But it's not always possible due to the internal policies of these companies. So sometimes we need to adapt and just be on site on the location also to review and implement our I would say deployments directly on the customer environment. So it's really different and will be always complicated, but I would say a lot of exchange with the IT department of this customer will help definitely to find a solution for it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Esteban and Noah, for that. Another question. This is a little bit of a longer question. I think the first part at least probably applies to Judy. Can you talk a little more about what controls are available to application administrators using CM Client that are related to security? For example, I know you can use CM Client to set password policies to apply to the environment. What else do we have control over in CribMaster?
Yes, there are features within CribMaster where you can encrypt a password or you can control how the password is applied. For example, let's see, let me share my screen again. For example, we can see that if you go to system options, there are features within the configuration where you can set password limitations or password length, mixed passwords. Those features are different options where we can control how the password, the length is, or if it needs to be expired immediately, if it's going to be how many characters. These gives you some additional options for that. The other thing is that if you encrypt a password, keep in mind that you do not want to do imports of passwords because importing does not encrypt the password and it can affect the all users' password. So that's one of those things that you just have to be a bit cautious about. Other ways to control security within CribMaster is quite vast. We do have some presentations from previous user conferences, item access codes. It's actually a lot of different ways to control access and to control the ability to utilize a tool. But again, that's another very long presentation, and we do have some presentations from user conference that describe it quite well, I believe.
Awesome. Thank you, Judy. So we only have a few more minutes. If there are any other questions, feel free to ask them now. But if not, I think that's a pretty good way to kind of segue into our conclusion for today. So I hope you guys all learned something about data security and compliance. And if you do have any questions about CribMaster's hosted services offering, how we can help you with data security or compliance, please feel free to contact your sales rep or email sales@cribmaster.com. We're always happy to help. So that's it from us. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good
Bye.
everyone.
Bye,
Have
everyone.
a wonderful rest
Bye,
of your day.
everyone.
Yes.